past couple of weeks, which is the G7 statement that was released a couple of weeks ago. And then after that, we then saw the OECD come out with a statement that was based off of the G7 statement. And as TJNA, what we really thought would be great was to have a conversation that was anchored on the African position. What are we feeling? What are we thinking about the discussions that are happening in the tech space, and what is our response? What would be the implications of these particular decisions that are being made? Some of you may have seen that the hashtag that we have for this particular meeting is Reject the G7 Deal. And this is for two reasons, which we will explore in today's particular webinar. The first is that as TJNA and along with various partners, we have really been of the view that these conversations need to be much, much more inclusive, calling for a UN tax body where even African countries and states have equal voice. And then the second one is that in principle, what we have been seeing as what's being put forward as this 15% minimum tax may not actually be in the best interest of many African countries. And so those are some of the discussions we'll be exploring today. So by way of program, by way of agenda, we have quite a distinguished panel that will be joining us today. Very quickly, my name is Chenai Mukumba, and I'm the Policy Research and Advocacy Manager at TJNA. And so I'll be moderating today's session. In addition to that, we will then have our colleague Jaco Olofsson, who will give us a little bit of an unpacking of what this G7 tax plan is, in order to give us a firm foundation and basically context within which to place these conversations. After that, we will then have Mr. Dereje, who I know is nobody who is new to the tax space, Dereje Alemehu, who is the Executive Secretary of the Global Alliance for Tax Justice. And he'll give us a couple of critical perspectives from the Global South, because I think one of the things that is very clear is that there's a lot of complementarity between what is going on in the Global South region. And so it's not specific to the African context. After that, we'll have a section where we will have alternatives and opportunities, and these will be given to us by Tony Salvador, who will be speaking on behalf of APNDD. Following which we will have a panel discussion where we have Mr. Logan Ward, the Executive Director for the African Tax and Administration Forum. We will have Yungong Theophilus Jong, who will be representing Afrodad, Irene Odida Ovonji, who sits on the UN FACTI panel, and then Alvin Mosioma, the Executive Director of Tax Justice Network Africa. So without any further ado, I'm now going to hand over to Jaco from AIDC. AIDC as well as Afrodad are our partners for this meeting that helped us put this together. And so handing over to Jaco to give us a quick unpacking of the G7 tax plan. Thanks, Jaco, over to you.
Thank you, Chenai. Just want to share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see it. Go ahead.
Great. Thank you, Chenai. So as AIDC, we share a lot of the criticism that's been put forward about the OECD G7 tax deal, especially in the African context of debt-driven austerity, underfunded public services, the pandemic, and the parallel economic crisis. We feel that the proposal is inadequate in a lot of ways, but I'm not going to deal too much with the details of our criticism in this presentation. Instead, as Chenai mentioned, I'm going to try and broaden the discussion and contextualize it by giving a high-level overview of the process so far and give ground for the discussion to follow. So to start, I guess, with where does the need for this international tax reform come from? I've identified three main themes here. And the first is the rate of globalization and technology change that we've seen in the past few decades. In terms of technology, the rise of the digital economy has meant that business activities can take place automatically across the world with barely any human input. And in terms of policy, the past few decades have also seen a consistent push for countries to relax the controls on the movement of capital and to plug into a global market where they compete to attract investment, which has led to tax competition and tax havens. And then the second point is that the regulations meant to govern this economic activity have not kept up with the new reality. The international tax rules in play come from principles, many of which devised the 1920s at a time when transnational corporations were relatively immobile and derived value largely from the transfer of tangible goods and services in a way that's not necessarily the case now. And this has led to a number of tax loopholes which can be exploited. And the third point is the corporate impunity that is enjoyed today. Although nations and citizens are often still generally restricted, corporations enjoy an unparalleled level of economic freedom. And with this and with the preceding points, we've seen the rise of complex financial planning that utilizes the many loopholes in the global economic system to move corporate profits around in a way that lets these corporations avoid their obligations to pay taxes. The lack of adequate regulation means that these corporations are often unaccountable, using complex ownership chains to hide their legal and financial links. And what this gives us is massive tax losses. We see estimates of around $1 trillion lost to this kind of profit shifting annually. And for Africa, $55 billion alone is lost to transfer mispricing each year, which is one common method of profit shifting. And these losses for Africa constitute more than half of the continent's funding gap, which is the missing resources and financing required to meet the basic developmental needs. So the OECD and G7 plan itself, where does that come from? Where does that fit in? To give kind of a very quick and perhaps oversimplified history, around 2013, the need for this international tax reform was very clear following the international financial crisis and the 2013 offshore leaks, which exposed the way in which offshore companies and trusts based in tax havens are used to avoid paying taxes. So in 2013, the OECD, following this, put forward a BEPS action plan, Base Erosion Profit Shifting Action Plan, which is endorsed by the G20. This identified actions that needed to be taken to plug these loopholes in tax law and to address the taxing challenges arising from a digitalized economy. By 2015, this had developed into a package of 15 BEPS actions, each attempting to address aspects of this problem. And up until then, the process had been a largely OECD-led one, along with some G20 cooperation. But following pressure from the G20 and developing countries, the OECD developed an inclusive framework in 2016, which is essentially a platform allowing countries to review and cooperate in the process, as long as they're committed to implementing the outcomes. Now, the plan currently on the table comes from the first of these 15 OECD BEPS actions meant to address digitalization and a global minimum tax. And this has been a slow process up until now. But the USA, which has historically been a stumbling block, given the fact that many of today's kind of digital tech giants are American, has had a shift in attitude with the new Biden administration, and especially the appointment of the new Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen. And in April, the US endorsed the two-pillar plan in Action 1. And this was met with widespread support from G7 countries who put their weight behind this at the G7 meeting last month. And then this was taken to the inclusive framework for endorsement last week, where endorsement on the plan was secured. So just two, or maybe one quick point before moving on, is that we can see that a lot of momentum has been gained very recently in this process, and it's been driven by political heavyweights, the G7, and especially the USA. And there's been a lot of contention around the details of this OECD Action 1, which this contention hasn't really been acknowledged in the recent push. And we can already see a kind of a first danger that these concerns will be ignored or overridden with the momentum that it currently has. So to move to the details of the proposal, the current proposal is made up of two pillars, Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. Pillar 1 is intended to deal with the realities of digitalization, namely that companies can source huge revenues from countries without ever having a physical presence there. It's supposed to allocate a portion of a transnational corporate group's global profit to market jurisdictions, which are these countries in which it gets revenue from these activities, such as advertising and so on. And Pillar 2 is more ambitious, and this is what really much of the media fanfare is focused on. Pillar 2 is an attempt to institute a global minimum tax without trying to force jurisdictions to change their own domestic tax rates. The idea is that this will disincentivize profit shifting by raising the floor of tax paid and also curb tax competition between countries. And this is the one that's attracted the most criticism, but we'll get into that later. And also at this point, it's worth acknowledging that these proposals do represent a historic shift away from some outdated notions of tax law. And it is breaking new ground. But as later speakers, I'm sure will point out, and we'll hear in the conversation, the substance and implementation of the shift and this challenge matters as much as the principle of the challenge itself. In other words, as so many people have pointed out in the past weeks, we need to look for the devil in the details. So very briefly to run through the two pillars. Pillar 1, which is the reallocation of taxing rights. Who does that apply to? Who will be taxed? So under the current proposal, multinationals will be taxed when they have a turnover of more than 20 billion euros and profit margins of more than 10%. This is the threshold test. They will also have to receive revenue from automated digital services, which are things like online advertising or consumer-facing businesses, which is the sale of goods and services specifically for consumer consumption, not commercial. We can think of something like Amazon here. This leaves only, according to the OECD, this leaves only a few hundred corporate groups which cross this threshold scope. And this is where we can see the problems start to creep in. So the second question of Pillar 1 is what will be taxed? And the group profit that will be eligible for reallocation is a portion of the residual group profit. And in practice, this means that 20% of group profit that is over 10% of revenue will be available for reallocation. And again, according to the OECD's own estimate, this will be around only 98 billion US dollars available in total. The third question is who will get this profit? So the countries that will be allocated a portion of this are countries where these corporations make more than a certain threshold of profit from relevant activities. And in the statement released last week, the threshold for establishing this eligibility was 1 million euros or 250,000 euros, depending on the GDP of the market jurisdiction. And then the fourth question, I guess, is what is the benefits of this? How much will we get? So each market jurisdiction will be allocated a certain amount based on how much in-scope revenue is made there from the relevant activities. And again, here, if we take this amount of $98 billion and apply the average tax rate on this, we see only about 24 billion in global tax revenue will be on the table from this, which is really a very, very small amount considering the massive global losses to profit shifting. And another kind of critical point to add is that Pillar 1 comes with some risky conditions. Countries who sign on to this will need to subject themselves to binding dispute resolution processes in cases where any of these former issues are criticized. And it's not sure that these processes will follow a logic that is really considerate of the interests and needs of developing countries. And the second point is that existing taxes which overlap with the scope of Pillar 1, such as digital service taxes, will have to be given up, or else the countries might face tariffs. And this means that countries have to give up a known source of tax revenue now for an uncertain and clearly very complicated source of tax revenue in the future, which will be subject to a lengthy review period. So moving on to pillar 2, and this is really what's been at the heart of a lot of the conversation. This pillar focuses on the establishment of a global minimum tax rate of 15%. I won't, for the sake of time, won't go too much into the details of this, but just to point out that the minimum rate of 15% is far below what many experts and African CSOs have been calling for, and it's certainly far below the average corporate income tax rate at the moment. Even the United States has been calling for a higher rate of at least 20%. Now, the crux of the issue with the global minimum tax rate is how the revenues from this tax will be allocated. And at the moment, in the current proposal, this newly taxed income will be allocated from a top-down approach under what's known as the income inclusion rule. So the jurisdiction where transnational corporate group's parent entity is based will get the primary taxing right, the first pick on these profits. Now, the problem is that corporate headquarters are generally based in wealthy countries, especially OECD and G7 countries. But source countries where value is created are the most in need of this tax revenue, especially for extractive economies. As we've seen, the lost revenue is needed not only to address the fiscal needs, but also to compensate for the harms of extractive industries and the permanent loss of non-renewable resources. And in cases where this rule cannot be applied, there is a backup rule, the under tax payment rule. And under this rule, the top-up tax from the minimum tax rate, the new tax revenues, will be allocated to countries through a formula-based approach, which is based on the amount of payments made from that jurisdiction to another corporate entity based in a low tax jurisdiction. And many organizations have been calling for this to be made the primary rule instead, given that it does advantage developing countries more. And then finally, we see the subject to tax rule, which is a supplementary rule. And this simply allows for the taxation of certain intra-group payments between members of the same corporate group when these payments are associated with common deductible payments used for profit shifting, such as interest deductions and management fees paid to tax havens. So I think that about covers the crash course of the 2 pillars. And I want to leave a strategic question on the table from these comments that I hope will be picked up in the discussion again. So from this, we see that the new development is undoubtedly a massive step forward in a process that's been stagnant for very long. It addresses some of the fundamental problems of an obsolete tax system, and the revenues are more badly needed now than ever in the context of COVID-19. If this process can be influenced and challenged from the inside, then its momentum could be used to deliver some real tangible practical benefits here now. But at the same time, there's also the question that this proposal is non-ideal and it's wrought with serious issues. Given the growing global pressure to not only address the tax system, but also economic inequality as a whole, including the change of tune by organizations such as even the IMF, would it not be better to use this moment to push for a more just process? Is there not a risk that engaging in this process now under the OECD, where developing countries' interests aren't well represented, that this will leave us stuck with a subpar deal that is ultimately to the benefit of wealthy nations, while also diffusing a serious effort, the serious challenge, and a push for an alternative process? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jaco. I think thank you so much for explaining what can often be quite a complex, I think, conversation to have. And I think thank you so much as well for leaving us with those questions that are really, I think, going to frame the conversation moving forward. I'd like now to call upon Dereje to give us a critical perspective from the Global South. So Jaco, thanks so much for sort of outlining and couching the conversation. So Dereje, if you could, I think, turn on your video and unmute your mic, we'd be really happy, I think, to hear your thoughts in terms of how this could potentially affect the Global South as a region. Over to you, Dereje.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, and thank you for the presentation as well. My predecessor, I'm not versed in technical tax as my predecessor. I am a civil society activist. I look at processes from another perspective, but I will just highlight the first point I want to make is it matters where negotiations take place. The institutional framework matters. In this sense, I have to go back a bit and say, if you may remember 2015, during the Financing for Development Conference in Addis, the draft outcome document was not signed in New York. Usually the drafts are agreed and the conference are rituals just to endorse the draft. There was one paragraph in it. It says, it calls for the establishment of a UN tax body. What did the OECD countries and the US, Japan, and the rest do? They said, we will not negotiate the rest of the document until this paragraph is pulled out. Why was it important for them? Because they didn't want the issue of fixing international tax problems, setting new rules and regulations within the mandate of the United Nations. They wanted to do it in their OECD. So they blocked it. The G77 countries were put under pressure by the host country to accept this defeat and made a statement saying, we have taken out the paragraph, but we are not going to give up the struggle. So it is very important that this negotiation is taking place at the OECD and international intergovernmental processes. The host is a very manipulative secretariat. It is not a neutral secretariat. It is an OECD secretariat which is manipulating the whole process. What does this mean for us as civil society? We don't know, we cannot hold our government, our delegates accountable for the positions they take because it is done behind closed doors. And look at the hierarchy of decision making. The G7 meet as heads of state, and then they decide as a political process to do something and mandate the OECD to do this and that. And then they bring it to the G20, which is again an informal structure. But the other countries which are allegedly signing this are not politically represented. We have read a couple of times through ATAF publications that there is a huge political pressure, carrot and stick involved to make countries meet. So it is not an open process. Negotiations are taken behind closed doors. There is manipulation. This is the process. Just compare with how other UN-based negotiations take place. We get the draft agreement. We input our civil society. We hold our government accountable for what they do and they don't do. We try to influence the outcome. So this is not the case. And then even in the informal negotiations so far, the so-called inclusive framework has become a Bermuda Triangle where concerns, proposals of developing countries are just disappear. The synthesis solution the OECD presents to its bosses, the G7, they don't include the worries and the concerns expressed by civil society as well as by also developing countries, including Qatar. The other one, and then we come to the content. I hear a lot about the historical move, the what, but look at it this way. If 90%, ASAF and others said the split of global profit into residual and routine does not make sense. ICRIC, which has economists like as member like Stiglitz, Piketty said, it just does not make sense. You can so now the bulk of the practice up to now will continue by using the transfer pricing guidelines, 90%, and then you have the 10%. So am I going to praise a reform, which is to reform 90 or 100 years old thing for allowing a small modification as regards 10% of the global profit and leave the rest as it is? This is one issue. Take the global minimum tax thing. It is closer to what the notorious tax havens were proposing, 12.5. It is far from the 25%, which is a global average of corporate income tax, and which would have made sense to make it minimum. So what has started now? We are already seeing it in countries. Instead of stopping rest to the bottom tax competition, this is going to create a race to the minimum tax between countries. Just imagine, countries, developing countries with no economic and political clout, now trying to impose something above the minimum tax. The pressure has already started. Multinational lobbies are already starting to say, let's go down to the minimum. And then the whole international tax issue is an issue about respecting the taxing rights of source countries. This one again cements the usurpation of taxing rights to headquarter countries of multinationals. I can go on and on. And then my worst fear is, the dispute resolution thing is going to be a very serious challenge to developing countries. Actually, one of the purposes of this deal of the rich, I think, is to preempt a democratic solution and to lock countries into an agreement which will, in the long run, harm their interests. In the short run, the benefits are small, but in the long run, it will be locking them into an unjust system and perpetuate the flow of resources from the south to the north. And then there is also another important thing. Tax is a sovereign right issue. Such dispute resolution mechanisms and other small print in this agreement will make it difficult for countries to introduce tax revenue raising measures, because they can be sanctioned, they can be blackmailed, this and that. So it is undertaken in a process which is not transparent, where there is manipulation, where there is political pressure. It does not give room any for government. If you say, let the rich decide and the poor, you are going back. If you compare it with how democracy progressed, it means, those who are rich will decide, the others will just implement what the rich do. That is the system that is, I don't care if the G20 represent 3/4 of the international economy, but they should not be mandated to do rules which are binding to non-member states. The only universal institution which has the mandate to do this is the UN. So tax reform, international tax reform issues, the institutional arrangements to do the reform and to oversee implementation should go back to an institution with a global, with a universal membership. So in my case, for the reasons I said and just briefly mentioned, and also as it is also stated in the concept note for this webinar, I would say, like you used to do during the WTO negotiations, no deal is better than a bad deal. It risks by locking us into a deal which has a long-term negative impact on our economies and our developing perspectives. It is usurpation of rights, so we should not cede, and especially the G20 thing. South Africa has no mandate to represent Africa, but South Africa can do service to Africa in saying, I have not consulted my brothers and sisters in the rest of the continent. I'm not going to endorse something that has not been endorsed by other African countries. That should be the stand South Africa should take. We don't want South Africa to represent us, but South Africa can block something that is harmful to Africa. So also the other G20 members from non-developing countries, I will not want to recognize the legitimacy of the G20 to decide on anything which is global, which is international. It is just a club of 20 countries, nothing more than that. If being rich gives you the mandate to decide, then let's go back to feudalism, where only those who have money can also decide which way the politics and the economy should go. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dereje. I think thank you so much for those comments. A lot of food for thought. In fact, I think for those of you who may have seen, we have put out a statement that we're requesting African civil societies to endorse that really speaks to a lot of what Dereje just said. And I think particularly one of our calls is that South Africa, as one of the African members of the G20, doesn't sign on to this onto this deal. Dereje, I like what you said about, it may actually be better to have no deal than a bad deal, as it locks us into that. But I mean, the panel still continues, very keen to hear what our other panelists have to think about that. So now I'm going to hand over to Tony, Tony Salvador. Tony Salvador is a trade union lawyer. He works with the Third World Network, and will be giving us a couple of alternatives and opportunities that we can think through as we have this conversation about the G7 statement and, of course, now the endorsement by the OECD. Tony, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chennai. Thank you also, Dereje and Jaco, for sorry for mispronouncing your names. Allow me to share the position of Philippine groups that we had issued, I think 2 days after the G7 so-called tax agreement. So this is the position of farmers' organizations, trade unions, international trade activists, social movements, and the academe. So basically, we do not share the euphoria expressed by the Western press regarding the recent tax agreement arrived at by the G7 governments, representing obviously the richest countries in the world. Sorry, a lot of what I'm going to share has already been mentioned by Jaco and Dereje too. The proposed corporate minimum tax rate of 15% would apply to the taxable income of corporations, their branches, subsidiaries, related entities organized in different jurisdictions. So this 15% seeks to counter the tax avoidance schemes of rich country corporations, be it through migration of intangible property, which now is becoming more important because of the digital economy, be it through financing subsidiaries, basically trying to find loopholes with regard to what's called thin capitalization rules, be it through foreign sales corporations or foreign services corporations, meaning they try to divert sales and revenues to low tax jurisdictions, etc., etc. This 15% minimum, while very low, potentially, and in quotes, could potentially be beneficial for working people, albeit only in rich countries, as the latter would be able to raise supposedly more revenues from their own multinational companies. Hopefully, that would redound to the benefit of their own people, but of course, that's a big if. However, the 15% corporate tax rate is not only ridiculously low, it is also utterly meaningless with respect to the billions of dollars earned by digital companies from developing and even developed countries, since these MNCs do not have or do not need any physical presence in those jurisdictions to make tons and tons of money. So, so we come now to the issue of permanent establishment. They are able to get away with the payment of corporate income tax because they will just say, well, we don't have permanent establishments in those jurisdictions. But supposedly, there's in this agreement, there's supposedly something for us with regard to the digital economy. It says that market countries would be, quote unquote, awarded taxing rights on at least 20% of the profits exceeding a 10% margin for the largest and most profitable MNCs. This is quite annoying for us here in the developing countries, because we have always been under the impression that the power of taxation, as Direje mentioned earlier on, emanates from us, the people, and that we eventually assigned it through our constitution to our Congress or to our legislature. But now the G7 countries are telling us that the power to tax is now being awarded to our country. Second, the concession will still be subject to negotiations at the OECD G20 level, another assembly of rich countries where developing countries are reduced to the role of onlookers merely. It is almost certain that this so-called concession will be given only in exchange for something else from developing countries. Third, the formula, the 10% on the 20%. If you listen to it, it looks simple, but operationally it's extremely complicated. So for example, what would be included in the revenues and the deductible expenses to arrive at the profit and the margin? And how would all these various items be allocated among the different tax jurisdictions? And of course, in the globalized economy, you're talking about conglomerates with 20 or so related entities in different tax jurisdictions, which makes it very, very complicated to come up with the 10% upon which to impose the 20%. One of the principles in taxation is it should be simple, administrative simplicity. And obviously that's thrown out of the window because of this kind of scheme. So how the computations and the allocations mentioned earlier on be affected by the many tax treaties and also by the controlled foreign corporation rules of each of the G7 countries, I should say, because the controlled foreign corporation rules started out in the US and has actually been copied by other very rich countries. But of course, the poor countries are not very familiar with these kinds of very complicated rules. And then how would the global intangible low tax income law of the US, we love GILTI, they call it GILTI, and we love the acronym and the humor in this. This kind of law and its analog in other countries, how would this affect the tax agreements that's being hammered out at the level of the G20? So surely us in the developing countries, especially civil society, labor unions, and farmer organizations, we cannot count on 1,000 transfer pricing specialists, 2,000 tax accountants, and 8,000 tax lawyers to keep up. Fourth, we are not even sure if there's anything in excess of the 10% margin upon which to impose again the 20% tax rate. So as similar to what Direje mentioned earlier on, we believe that an acceptable international tax agreement can only come from an authentic, inclusive process, which is possible only at the United Nations. It's not possible to have one at the G7 or even at the so-called G20 OECD quote-unquote inclusive framework, where participating countries are again thrown out of the decision-making process. At this point, let me allow me to speak a little about the WTO. And surprise, surprise, it's actually for us, although our position hasn't been gaining traction, for us, this is very crucial. Since 1998, the WTO, every 2 years, renews its moratorium on the imposition of customs duties on e-transmissions of goods and services, or electronic transmissions of goods or services. Basically e-commerce. So there's a moratorium. So countries cannot impose tariffs on those, and obviously tariffs are a huge source of revenue. And to further add further damage, there exists a negotiating text that contains an absolute prohibition on customs duties on electronic transmission of goods and services, which would mean that an important aspect of e-commerce taxation is arrogated unto themselves by WTO partisans and snatched away from the legislators or legislatures of all other nations, thus ensuring that a holistic international discussion and negotiated outcome on e-commerce taxation would be all but impossible.
Tony, you have about a minute left.
Yeah. So we are saying that if we lose this battle at the level of the WTO, we can say goodbye to the e-commerce e-commerce tax rules, or say goodbye to a fair e-commerce tax rules. So given that, we therefore demand that the sovereignty of developing nations be respected and their legislatures not be at any time impeded or prevented from performing their duty to pass tax laws. Of course, we are also discouraging our countries while exercising this jurisdiction to refrain from giving tax holidays. We demand discussions on a new and comprehensive international tax legal framework on taxation that should be undertaken at the level of the United Nations alone. Decisions on customs duties on electronic transmission of digital goods and services should be removed from the WTO and incorporated into the proposed comprehensive negotiations on taxation only at the level of the United Nations. At the national level, we ask the Philippine ambassador to the WTO to state that the Philippines opposes any renewal of the multilateral moratorium on customs duties on e-commerce. We want them to oppose any text on the plurilateral e-commerce negotiations that would ban the imposition of customs duties on e-commerce. And finally, we want to remove any provision that would prohibit source countries from demanding from digital companies that their business in a taxing jurisdiction be conducted only from within. I will share our statement. So thank you very much for allowing us to share our thoughts on this.
Thanks so much, Tony. Absolutely. If you could share your statement to all those who are listening in, we'll be sure to share all the documentation that's been used for today's webinar. I think one of the things that's very clear from what Tony is saying is that there are such synergies between the concerns, I think, that African civil societies have, particularly with other countries in the global south. And so thank you so much, Tony, for sharing that, and also for indicating the work that you're doing within the Philippines, I think, to try to push for some of the reforms that you've spoken to. You mentioned, I think, particularly this sort of impingement on sovereignty. And I think this is also, you know, quite a key idea that we need to think through as we delve into this topic in much more detail. As we now go into the panelist section, that first section was really just to kind of give us a bit of a background. I'm now going to ask Mr. Logan Wart, who is from the African Tax Administration Forum. ATAF has put out a number of statements, I think, in response to both the G7 deal and then much more recently, the OECD statement that came out. Logan, would you be so good as to share some of the thoughts that ATAF has on the current conversation, as well as some of the recommendations that you're putting forward, you know, based off of some of the comments and the input that you've been giving into this conversation?
Thank you, Chena, and thank you to the panelists. I think I really enjoyed each panelist and the insight that they gave. You know, maybe Yaku, you asked about inside versus outside. The risks are huge. The OECD, the G7, and the G20, we're going to make a decision either way, with or without us. And so the role of civil society mobilizing, especially between now and the G20 meeting, and showing the fundamental flaws in this deal are critically important. And then there's the issue that others are faced with, that in the end, these things are decided on people with mandates. And so African leaders have signed up to this. Now, we argue that you know, I don't know to what extent one can continue to say this and what extent we'll offend the leaders, but we are aware of phone calls and threats and diplomatic moves in the week up to the decision. It's only Kenya and Nigeria who held firm. Everybody else have signed up. That was part of the inclusive framework. Every 28, not just South Africa. And by the way, South Africa, Mauritius, and Morocco's interest is different to the rest of the continent, because they also, just as much as they market jurisdictions, they're also residence jurisdictions. And so a lot of the issues doesn't coincide with the interest, just for that. But I think it is critically important that we understand that this deal is not the deal that's going to benefit developing countries or African countries. So why would we say we welcome? What we welcome is the fact that there was something that is going somewhere so that some people can respond. Because between March and that deal, 8 have developed its own set of proposals. What happened in March? In March, I contacted the OECD, had a meeting with Pascal Santama and said, we considering asking countries to walk away because there's nothing in this, in your blueprint for African countries. We are putting together a proposal. Don't tell us it's too late. We demand our proposal be heard. And that is what happened. Now, will we manipulated? Did they give us some bones to chew? Probably. I don't know. What I do know is that you cannot argue about the deal if you did not participate in it. And if you lose and you were not heard, that is when you rally, especially you bring in your civil society support. And so that is why I think this is such an important event. Now, I think it's important to understand at the moment, colleagues, I want to say comrades, because I feel so close to you, all of us. At the moment, there is no tax revolution. At the moment, the tax hegemony is being held by the OECD and the G20 and the G7. And when Biden came in, that is when the deal was struck. Let's face it. Interestingly, in 8 of proposals, we demanded, the Reggie, and thank you for your really good input, we demanded a minimum tax of 20%. The US demanded 21%, actually more aggressive than us. But in the end, when these guys negotiate, they negotiate with each other. And then we hear that this is what is negotiable and this is what is not negotiable. We do not have the political clout nor the economic clout to say deal or no deal when a developed country representative that owns more than 80% of global economy gets up and say, well, we're not moving, and if you don't like this, we're going to go ahead with it. And we'll sort all of these things out with your country, with our trade department. Now, you say that to a minister of trade in Chad or Ghana, and then you'll see. And so I'm saying that the issues of those inside are difficult, and it's not something that I'm familiar with because I'm on the outside. That's my history. But this is on the inside. And in the end, African ministers were not there. African discussions were not held. What were the African discussions? It's the ones we had with Alvin and TJNA. It's the 4 technical notes. It is the 13 Africa-wide consultations that we've had, 28 African countries at the time. So everything that was done and was said, and we didn't get what we wanted to do. And that's the important part of this. What is important about this? We didn't get what we set out to do. What didn't we get? We didn't get a global minimum tax of more than 20%, because average M&E tax in Africa is 30% and more. So you don't stop base erosion and profit shifting. We didn't get the taxation of multinationals on their profit. We had to take a share of residual profit. In fact, what we did get was significant shifts, and I don't want to take too much time, but the things we got were things that was never going to be received. But it is not enough because, as all of you say, the devil is in the detail. We got those thresholds down. We got the nexus threshold down to 250,000 from 20 million for small countries. Now, what does all this mean? Is this crumbs off the table? You can probably say that. But what it will mean next year is a massive boost for revenue while we are fighting the deal. There isn't a tax revolution where we're going to overthrow anybody that's in charge of tax. And so what do we do in the meantime when there's hunger and health and other needs? We must negotiate and take. And then we must have an alliance with the global south and deal with the fact that the UN is not strong enough, that the world tax body is what must answer them, but that vested interest is doing them. But a big element of all that is quiet in all of this, I'm not so sure about the Philippines, Tony, but all that is quiet in all of this are the heads of state, the finance ministries of developing countries. And they enjoy getting invited to G20 meetings and hobnobbing with everybody and then sign. But everybody who has signed up to the Global Forum on Exchange of Information, to the Inclusive Framework, and to this, if you want to do research, try and find out a link between that and a phone call or a visit from a developing country head or senior official. I'm not saying our leaders can't do this. Civil society is right. We must push this. But a lot of the weakness in the deal that we got was, one, developing country uniting and protecting the interest. Africa was the only continent that fought together. Everybody else fought as countries because we got the AU involved. And I'll conclude. There are a number of risks here. If developing countries don't unite, the detail, I think Yaku said and the Reja said, the details will change. And so the UN must take a stand on how to do this. And Madame Ngozi Nkonjo-Iweala, who's now head of WTO, Tony, must help us because we've been fighting to get that e-commerce ban abolished. So in conclusion, I agree with you. This is not the best deal. There are inside and outside battles. We must unite and use the levers from where we have the strategic initiative. And in that way, we must make sure that the devil that's in the detail is being acted upon. Let's not just stand outside. Let's help each other and actually bring technical people to help give detail to countries to say this. Then we can talk. I thank you.
Logan, thank you so much for those comments. I think, first of all, the passion with which you speak, incredible. And I think it speaks to not only how strongly you feel about the way in which African countries have not been fairly represented in this current conversation, but also how we need to increasingly rally together for us to have a say in the discussions that are happening happening at the same time. I'd now like to move on to our next distinguished panel, Ms. Irene Odida Ovunji. She was a member of the UN FACTI panel. Many of you know that this report was launched earlier this year and came up with a number of recommendations, one of which was the need for us to have this world tax body that speaks to the global tax system where all countries, particularly African countries, have an equal say. So Irene, I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you so much for joining us. I know it's super early where you are, so thank you for waking up early as well. But just over to you to share some of your thoughts with regards to the current conversation.
Thanks, Chinai, and hi everybody. Hi Logan. This it's a good conversation, I think, because we're moving beyond, we're discussing really from our hearts, what we're really thinking and what we're really feeling about this. And I think this is the kind of conversation we need to have regularly. Consultation, kind of just getting a feel for where everybody is. And I think the other really important thing about it is having a third world network. So to have a discussion, beginning or continuing across the global south. So it's not just Africa, but we're talking to Asia, we're talking to Latin America. That is really important. And also another bit around the coalitions is finding allies beyond developing regions. So within the global north, where are the allies there, and TJN itself, is being one of those kind of networks that does that. So it's really important. And the other thing is, for me, my take on this is, it's quite evident from all this discussion how complex reform is, and that complexity is really rooted in the complexity of the from a technical perspective. So it's really technical. So the the unpacking of what the G7 deal means was important to begin with for those who are not experts. I don't consider myself an expert, and there are many people who we need in this struggle who will not be technical experts. So that's really important to have that understanding and that connection, but above all, that it's a political fight. This is a political struggle, and this is come through from the different discussions. It's about power, and Logan's frustrations and others that have talked about this. These are power issues. It's about the political economies involved. It's about vested interests. So that balance in our planning and mobilizing going forward is really important. So as we plan, what do we do? What needs to be done? We have to factor both of those in. It's technical, it's complex, so the experts have to be in the room and supporting those who are involved in the process, whether we're talking about farmers, or trade unions, or we're talking about policymakers, finance ministers, or foreign ministers, trade ministers, but also the power dynamic must be addressed in any planning moving forward. Obviously, as everybody here is saying, this deal has very little for developing countries. The big struggle, as you all know, in the past decades, has been around allocation of taxing rights between the now advanced countries, represented by the G7 or OECD, and the rest, the developing countries, the G77, the Africa group, and so on. So that's the bottom line. That's the struggle. How do we ensure that our countries benefit in increased tax revenues in light of the recognition, as underlined by the Addis Ababa Agreement, that the only path to development, the only real path to development for a country will depend on it having sufficient domestic public revenues. It's not going to be aid that's going to do it. It's not going to be debt that's going to give us the resources that are needed for that kind of investment in public goods. And in this time with COVID, with this pandemic, it's just kind of illustrated again why it's that important for governments to have that sort of source. We can see the differences in response, in the COVID response, from what the now rich countries, and I keep saying now rich, because historically that's not set in stone, and the rest, what kind of options are available and are not available when you don't have that sort of buffer in your treasury. So fundamentally, that's what it is. And the other thing, just to remind us, because as we think about the power issue and the power dynamic, just to keep reminding us that despite the narrative out there about the little contribution or share of Africa to the global economy or of developing countries, if we're looking in terms of of resources, objectively resources that we have, whether we're talking about the natural resources or the human resources, the picture is very different. So we're looking at an Africa where we have 30% of the world's oil and minerals are in our continent. And if one looked at Asia or Latin America, you see again the same kind of wealth. The natural resource wealth endowment is huge. So there's something completely wrong with what's happening, and we all know it's really around those relationships that are extractive between our former colonies and the former colonial masters. So that's extractive relationship. That's the issue. And this deal to me is another nail in our dreams of trying to extract ourselves from that extractive relationship. So moving forward, therefore, I think we have to have much more around the narrative that reminds those who are seeking progressive reform of what is wrong with the current situation. That we are not poor. It is this relationship which is impoverishing. So there is something to fight for, and there is some power that we have to fight for. And so let us change from believing that we have nothing and we bring nothing to the table. There is plenty that we bring to the table. This is why foreign direct investment is a thing. If there was nothing in our countries, they wouldn't be coming there. So getting that shift in perspective, I think is really important. And how do we get that? You know, Logan's talked about the frustration that our leaders, our policymakers who are at the table do not necessarily share that understanding. I think a lot more needs to happen around creating the shift. Over the past 30, 40 years of neoliberal advancement, we've had a shift in our political leadership and also technocrats from understanding the situation to a new worldview that is actually inimical to negotiating with the rest of the world. A lot more has to happen around that. And this is one of the things I had a discussion with when I joined ICRIT around, yes, it's important for the tax justice community, for the institutions involved in it on civil society side to engage with the OECD and to challenge, you know, so the kind of work that you're doing at ATAF, but it's also important to have continuous engagement with the developing countries' structures, as ATAF is now is doing with the AU. That kind of thing has to be replicated so that the structures that mobilize and coordinate developing countries, whether it's the AU or other similar regional bodies in Asia and in Latin America, that engagement with them is equally important and it needs to be as consistent as the engagement with OECD on these tax issues to build that capacity and that coherence of positions of the G77 country members. So G77 itself as a collective that brings together our regions is another that we need to have that constant engagement with. And it's one of the things I've been trying to push about the whole of last year as the factory process was going on. We have to do that, and we can't simply say decisions are happening at the OECD, that's where we're going to put attention. We have to focus on how does the other side that comes to the table to the OECD, how is their capacity, how is their coherence, how do we do that, how do we build that? So connecting to Addis Ababa, connecting to the G77 or AU in Paris, in Geneva, in New York, really critical, you know, so that they are able to come to the table and negotiate in an as organized fashion as the other side. Related to that, and this point has been made by a number of people here as well, that we know that Derete talked about the constant pressure on countries to sign up, and that's currently we'd see it's only Kenya and Nigeria that have held out, but the pressure is real, and the calls that happen right at the levels of heads of state. I recall as a parliamentarian in the East African Parliament, similar kind of things happening within the WTO processes that we were engaging as parliamentarians, as legislators, to support executives engaging in the negotiations. This was between 2002, 1 and up to 2006, that time. So with the Cancun and Hong Kong ministerials, the constant pressure on heads of state, on ministers, and on ambassadors from the global south, continuous. I recall even during the factory process, the same kind of pressure, you know, that was applied and still is applied even now to the Secretariat, and this is within UN, you know, to ensure that they do not advance a balanced position. So that is constant. I think for us, one of the things we really need to push from our policymakers is that there needs to be a clarity, a blueprint, if one could call it, of what we as Global South are fighting for, that is applied in whichever forum issues relating to that comes up. So we know that through tax, through trade, you know, through diplomacy, through lending, certain conditions are pushed on our countries. So there needs to be discussion internally. And I think civil society can help contribute to developing those positions. What is the the bottom line? What are the basic pillars for the Africa group, for the AU, whether they're discussing loans to deal with COVID, whether they're discussing the tax position in the OECD BEPS process, whether they're discussing something at here in New York, you know, around the General Assembly, whatever it is, whether it's at the WTO in Geneva or in Paris at the OECD. So there has to be that kind of what's the bottom line? What are the red lines we're not going to cross? And some of those, I think, are positions that many of you have taken, and some of the positions that we took up in the FACTIC process itself, including around the negotiating forum. I think that's like that's like a non-negotiable. Issues around binding dispute resolution mechanisms, that should be a non-negotiable. I mean, if one listens to the experience, and we heard this from Pakistan and a whole range of countries, the experience of countries in those tribunals, and how those tribunals privilege the interests of corporations over states, you know, and how that has impacted on developing countries and beginning to impact even on countries in the global north in terms of payments that they have to make out of losses that they make in India, for example. So there needs to be a certain red line, and that red line applies whichever forum our countries are in. We see that kind of coordination evidently, you know, between, say, OECD and EU with the blacklist and so on. So we need to start doing that sort of thing as well. And we have to crack this issue of how do we get a shift in the minds of our finance policymakers? How do we ensure that there is a connection between the finance ministers and the revenue administrators, so that that fragmentation, which we see in this process, the quote unquote inclusive process between our policymakers and the tax administrations, and which then impacts on the negotiating capacities, that is removed. So there's work to be done, but I believe that there's so much worth fighting for that we should not just give up. What kind of position should our countries take on this? My view is that this should be a deal that they walk away from, you know. And I agree with, you know, with Dereje. We had that mantra in the WTO talks. I still recall in Cancun, you know, no deal is better than a bad deal. You know, there is a time when lose-lose is a better proposition than win-lose, and this looks to me more and more like that. So finally, where will the power come from to do this? I think first, above all, it's around organizing. You know, in Uganda, we always say within civil society, you know, stop agonizing and organize. So that's a starting point, you know, organizing. And that organizing means we have to cut across the silos. So the human rights, the tax justice groups, the social movement actors, we need to start linking up better. And for the experts, the technocrats in the room, the technical people in the room, how do you work with the social movements to break down, to unpack these technical things to something that social movements, trade unions, and you know, women's movements and so on can relate to, because they have a certain power and momentum, land movements, certain power and momentum from organizing in a different way. How do we break beyond this tax justice bubble to bring those guys on board? Because there's a power that they bring in as well. So that's one. And then how do we use the technical experts to connect better to the state actors, who are the decision makers, who will actually be at the table when decisions are being made? That needs to be done, and to use to really dismantle some of the, sorry to use this word, some of the rubbish in this, you know, in deals like this, the lack of rationale. You know, where did this residual routine come from? So some of those things need to be exposed. And that's where the technical expertise, the economists and so on can play a role in doing that. But all this needs to be coordinated, and this cooperation has to happen across the different groupings, but also vertically, horizontally, and across the different regions. I think this thing has to be fought.
Thank you so much, Ms. Irene. Really, really appreciate your thoughts. And I was really scribbling notes as you spoke, because I think you gave us so much in terms of a way forward, practical action steps that we need to be taking, not only as civil society, but also just as African countries and the broader global South. So thank you so much for those comments. I'm now going to hand over to, I can see Logan clapping his hands there. I'm now going to hand over to Theo. I mentioned earlier that this meeting was put together by AIDC, Aphrodite, and AIDC. Aphrodite has been doing a lot of work on debt on the continent, and especially looking at the relationship between taxation, IFFs, and debt. So Theo, I'm going to hand over to you, and if you don't mind, I've been a terrible moderator. If you could keep your comments brief, just that we can allow for Q&A at the end of this conversation.
Thank you, Chennai. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Hello?
Yes, go
ahead. Can
ahead.
you hear me, Chennai? I'm sorry, I'm joining because of mistiming. It said 2 p.m. Central African time, actually, which is GMT +1. But I was surprised to realize that was actually supposed to be 1 p.m. East Africa time. So I'm sorry to join late. And that said, please, I will turn off my video because I'm running low on internet bandwidth, so it's very unstable. So I'll just prefer to go without the video, if you don't mind.
That's okay, go ahead.
Thank you. All right, thank you so much, Chennai, and thank you to all those who have spoken, and to TJNA for putting together this event. And actually, compared to the profits that multinationals are making, we at Aphrodite, we agree with the fact that, the fact that less developed countries are faced with a lot of tax evasion and issues of illicit financial flows, and the 15%, tax rate is too low, and then on top of that, we are faced with a situation where the arrangement from the G7 gives rights to market-based countries above 15%, and this is a clear discrimination against low-income countries, and something that civil society has to flag. And we are glad that TJN is already doing this. I'm sorry, if you can still hear me, please just indicate.
We can still hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Chennai. Thank you. So I think it's already great that TJN is already doing this. And at the moment, African civil society organizations do not have a common position on the METR that the TJN is proposing. There is no common African position on this, and this leaves us with the responsibility, to galvanize, a common African position on the METR. And the current letter that you issued, already, points towards this direction. It's already a step towards that direction, but we must admit that there is more to be done. At the level of Aphrodite, we endorse your position and the TJNA position on METR, though also being very, very fully cognizant of the fact that, the expected potential benefits or revenue that will be generated from this will still not be enough, to cover current debt servicing commitments of African countries and to finance their development plans. And the current tax arrangement keeps pointing us to one direction, towards pushing us towards, relying on debt. It's pushing us towards debt profiteering mechanisms that we African countries have been experiencing for a very, very, very long time now. After coming out of HIPIC, we are back into pre-HIPIC situation, and you mean taking the tax rights, so African governments' ability to tax, this taking it away from them, will always perpetuate a situation where countries will always tend to depend on borrowing and on debts, to finance their development plans. Which we are not saying that is a bad issue, but then I think African countries do not have to limit the opportunities, the development financing windows to debt alone. And then the question now is the undemocratic process, through which the decision on the minimum tax was taken, is clear proof that Africa's interest is always at the sidelines. It's always, no one really cares about African interest, or African interest is only looked after where there is a benefit. And for us to move out of this situation and for us to be in a position where we have Africa's interest on the mainstream, I think the African civil society have a very, very big responsibility to play in this respect. It's a wake-up call for countries not to also sell the tax rights, and and their potential to make sovereign decisions on issues of taxation and of mobilizing resources, for development. Or it is their responsibility to make sure that they take full charge of what is required within their sovereign jurisdictions to mobilize resources, through tax, because I think that's the most reliable instrument in the hands of African countries, that they must not give that out, they must not give that up, because they are not very much in control of how development financing through debt works. And if African countries end up giving up or giving out this right, then I'll say that African countries would have put themselves in a very downhill position that will end up in a very disastrous way. And then one thing is about African countries in situations like this, where African countries should not be rule takers. We at Afrodat have been talking about African countries playing the position of rule makers as well. And the current predicament, demands action to reverse a situation where African countries from the past and for a long time have been in a position where they are always in the receiving end of things. And how African countries can put themselves out there as equal partners is a responsibility that African civil society has to take, and then African governments have to play their role as well. So civil society, like I said, have a critical role to play. And where does this begin? This is a very important question for us to consider. Where does this start? I think the most important problem African countries have faced is the fact that we are ideologically weak. These issues of other countries having, having the power to sit and make decisions that affect African countries in the absence of African leaders and the African people. It's taking advantage of the fact that African countries have been ideologically weak for a very, very long time. And it is time for us to, as civil society and as African people, to have a common African ideology. It might not be common, but then we need to be ideologically sound, even if we don't agree. Even if we don't agree on how this has to work, but we need to be ideologically sound. Because once you are not ideologically sound, there is always room for people to take advantage, of situations like the current one we are discussing.
Yeah, thank you so much,
and then
Theo. Sorry,
yeah,
because we're running out of time a little bit. So I'm hoping perhaps as we go through the Q&A, you'll be able to add some of the comments that you had at the end.
Okay.
Perfect.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, great. But I think the point around needing to raise enough revenue to ensure that we don't find ourselves in this current debt situation, which is worse than the pre-HIPIC, I think is very clear. I'm now going to go very quickly to Mr. Alvin Masioma. Alvin, I'm going to ask you to give a couple of comments. I'll be really strict just because you're my boss. 5 minutes. And then we will open it up. So can I encourage all of you? I can already see a lot of questions in there. We may not have access to to go to all of them, but definitely we will ensure that a couple of them are answered. So Alvin, over to you.
Yes, Chennai, I'll try to take less than the 5 minutes you have given me, because I know you will shut me down. You'll make your threat true. So I'm going to start by asking two very rhetorical questions. The first one is that, should we complain if we have been invited to a party and the hosts decide to give you snacks while they are in the other room having a full course menu? Should we be complaining? That's the first rhetorical question I'm just throwing out there. The second one is, should we be complaining if we go to a fixed match where the referee is from the same side of the opponent? And I think these two questions actually underline the fundamental conversation we're having here about the underlying structural challenges that face the global tax arena. And I think it has been captured by different speakers who talked about the hegemony. I think Logan talked very, very clearly about the lack of political power. This is really the questions that we face. And what has happened really many a times that we have ended up responding to those questions through technical responses. And I think one thing that if we should take away from this conversation, this is a political struggle. This is a political fight, and we need to organize politically. That's my very, very first point. This is a political fight, and it cannot be won on technical arguments. My first point. The second point is that, again, we need to like, for political, when we talk of lack of political will is not bought through magnanimity of the other side. It has to be, and it has to be forced. We have to manufacture political will, and we do that through organizing. And I think Irene spoke to that. And we need to invest really in the simplification of the conversation. We need to get people on board to get these conversations.
Is it just me, or can
So,
Alvin has frozen?
yeah, yes, frozen. It's not just you.
Okay.
They need
Like
to switch off his camera.
Okay, so Alvin, you'd frozen for about, I think about 10, 15 seconds. So I would propose perhaps, yeah, go ahead.
So I was talking about the need for simplification of the messaging, that the message that we are passing. We need to make sure that we are not just in the effort of conducting as a political exercise. We need to make sure that the messaging we are putting across simplified messages that really boil down what is the quintessence of this issue. And the quintessence here is that, yes, we're going to seal some loopholes in the global tax arena, but the people that will be walking laughing to the bank are not African countries, they are not poor countries, it's the rich countries. They have, and it's no surprise that they will design solutions that work for them. That, I think, messaging in those kind of ways is going to be critical. The fourth point that I would like to make, Chennai, is that, I mean, many people, of course, we have had this conversation, Logan and others, Irene and others, 6, 7 years, speaking about
Switch your camera off.
to delegitimizing.
Yes. Alvin, sorry, would you mind turning off your camera?
Okay, I'll turn on my camera.
Thank you.
I think we need to delegitimize the OECD and the OECD's power to make global rules. And I think the Reje spoke that very, very strongly. That legitimization is...
Alvin. Okay, it seems we've lost Alvin, but I think that's not a problem. What I'll also just ask him to do when he comes back on is also just give, I think, some remarks right at the end to sort of close up the meeting. So we have 10 minutes now, because the meeting was supposed to go for 1 hour 35, where we have an opportunity to ask some questions. I will try and refrain from asking questions that already have answers. but I think at a minimum, I can at least try and get, I think, one answer, one question to each of our distinguished panelists. So there's a question here from Daniel. And the question is, what does the global minimum tax rate of 15% mean for developing countries with export processing zones or special economic zones with huge incentives for corporations? And I know this is something that's quite prevalent in a number of African countries. Jaco, if you don't mind, I'm going to throw that to you. And then there's a question here from Lenmore that says, what guarantee do we have that a better deal will come from, say, a UN tax body, considering that the UN has its own politics? Irene, I hope you don't mind. I'm going to throw that question to yourself. And then Crystal has a really interesting question here. And Logan, I don't know if you can speak to it, but I think we saw with the OECD that the only two African countries that didn't sign on were Kenya and Nigeria. And Crystal here says, I'm used to Kenya selling us out. Not my words, Crystal's words. And I think a lot of people would like to know sort of, you know, what were some of the dynamics within that conversation that had, for example, Kenya and Nigeria not signing on? How have your engagements been with those countries? So I think those three questions first, and then we'll see if we can go back. So Jaco, are you able to answer the first one?
Sure. I'm not a disclaimer, I'm not a technical tax expert myself, but I can take a stab at it. Daniel, I think, so in cases where special economic zones provide these massive tax incentives, in cases where that brings the effective tax rate down below that 15%, then the Pillar 2 proposal will kick in. Mm-hmm. And as it's currently put, then that difference, that newly tax revenue, that will then go to the headquarters jurisdiction of the relevant corporation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I add to that?
Yes, please, go ahead, Logan.
Thank you so much. The important aspect of this, and I hope Alvin can hear, the important aspect of this is some research that TJ&A did that says the total loss to African economies through tax incentives is 3.5% or 3.7% of GDP. Now, what does this mean? So we can argue about 20%, 15%, 30%, but what does it mean? It means that those unwarranted, unsubstantiated, and often secret incentives is not going to help anyone. Because if you in Chad or South Africa or Kenya or anywhere, if you choose not to impose that, this rule says somebody must impose it. So you're basically just giving away your 15% to someone else. And so if you've got friends in the mining industry and they normally used to oil your palm, what, it's going to be difficult now because you're going to have to explain what happened to the 15% minimum. And so that is the one positive out of this. The negative, of course, out of this is that the export processing zones are often domestic businesses. And just like the developed world, especially the UK and Ireland and others, they give their small and medium enterprises economic boosts. But you don't see the EU putting sanctions on them. Last year, the EU sanctioned 13 African countries for these zones. So the domestic businesses in Africa is going to suffer if they get any form of tax incentive. And so part of what we need to do now in Africa or in developing countries in general is to try and come up with a different package that don't violate this for domestic businesses. Because let's face it, I'm sorry I'm long, but let's face it, globalization of the economy is crowding out domestic businesses. Yeah. And governments have a responsibility to protect them. And so if that 15% is reducing government's ability to protect them, then we must get together and look at other forms of support. Those countries that survived COVID financially are the countries that keep the economy liquid by governments and revenue authorities putting cash into the economy. So, you know, African governments don't have a shortage of cash. Irene will tell you the amount of money that flows out here. And so I think all of us know. And so I think there is a solution to that. But the bottom line is that on the big incentives that we lose on multinationals, your choice is tax them or somebody else is going to take it, but somebody is taking it.
Yeah.
And the other one is with the domestic businesses. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was one of the issues we saw when we were looking at the income inclusion rule, right? That if you don't have it, you know, it goes to headquarters and ultimately developing countries lose. But I think, Logan, whilst we still have you, that question from Crystal, just around some of the dynamics that happened with Nigeria and Kenya not signing or not endorsing the OECD statement. Do you have any insight into that?
I somehow get the impression you are both Kenyan and you're trying to get me into trouble.
I'm not Kenyan.
Okay, all right. But I'll give you the answer I gave to Crystal because it doesn't look like that you saw the answer. My answer to Crystal was simply, I think that Nigeria and Kenya simply stood their ground. And they had all of the countries, even countries in Europe, in Latin America, in Asia, everybody has reservations. It's only the G20 countries that has no reservations, people. So everybody feels that they did not get the optimum. But let's come to your question. I don't know the official reason, but from where I sit, because I work closely with all of the countries, and Nigeria led the ATF delegation in this whole 3 years. And Kenya, either themselves through the Revenue Authority, but the ATF international expert that led the ATF work on this, Munanda, is Kenyan. And I'm raising all of this because in Kenya, there was a very thorough understanding of the issue. And so my feeling is that Nigeria and Kenya stood their ground. There are certain fundamental things here that I think that Nigeria and Kenya probably, this is not official, probably decided not to budge on, and that is mandatory binding arbitration. We got thrown a bone to say mandatory binding arbitration is now only for countries in scope, for companies in scope. So it's not the transfer pricing stuff, Tereja, it's not all of them anymore. We managed to get that out. But all the countries are then in the digital, right? So we managed to narrow that. But it also means that if you're not a small economy, and Kenya isn't, and Nigeria isn't, then you will be subject to binding arbitration. And as Africa, we've rejected this as a deal breaker. Of course, we didn't have power to walk out and so on and so forth. But that conversation must continue, and our leaders must take that conversation to the G20. The other thing that I think Kenya stood firm on is digital services tax. And there's a very specific threat. I must choose my words. There's a very specific, let me say threat hanging over all of this. And that is that if you introduce digital services tax, we are going to apply trade sanctions to you. I'm not going to mention the name. I will leave that to your imagination. Because since the change of government, the aggression has been severe. And so I think just like Kenya, just like other countries, Kenya and Nigeria may have had diplomatic attempts to talk to them and they decided to stand their ground. That's all I can say. It's my own speculation. Mr. Mbiti Mburu, is a man of great principle. I don't know if he has the support and if Nigeria and Kenya will hold out because they're kind of isolated at the moment. And we need people to support them. And for those who signed up, we also need people to support them, not to condemn them, because in the technical stuff, we must get the deal. And we're not going to get the perfect deal. But anyway, that's my answer, Senna.
Yeah, no, thanks so much, Logan. Thank you for that. Irene, over to you. I think there's a big question around, we're all saying, the panacea to all of this would be the UN tax body, but the UN has its own politics. What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, definitely, and I think this kind of also builds on what Logan just mentioned. Just quick thing on that first question. I think it's really important for countries to do a cost-benefit analysis of the proposal of the deal. In revenue terms, what does it actually mean? And I think TJN might have something on that already, but if you can direct, government representatives to look at that. So they look at what does it actually mean for your country? This is what you're going to gain, this is what you're going to lose in terms of revenues and also in terms of your future policy space. So the issues, for example, around arbitration or around DSTs. Will you be able to have tax policy, have any control over tax policy in the future? And what are you signing away? So about the UN, and we had this debate as well within the FACTI. One of the views that was presented to us was just around, the UN does not have capacity. It doesn't have the technical capacity. It doesn't have the wherewithal, to coordinate anything around tax rules. The OECD is much more efficient, that sort of thing. And so we had to engage with that. I think ultimately the issue is that the UN is a space where all countries are members on an equal basis. That's the bottom line. And there is a report that South Center did last year. I was part of that, which was analyzing the OECD process and the imbalances or the asymmetry within it in terms of access and leadership and decision making for countries, for other members who are non-OECD. So whether it's called inclusive framework or not doesn't matter. The issue is in terms of the leadership, who heads the committees or the working groups, who sets the agenda, what gets onto the agenda, what are the rules around how decisions are made. And here in the discussion today, we've had this elaboration about how, I think it was Dereje or somebody else who talked about the hierarchy. So you have a G7, where does that fit within the OECD structures? You have G20. So this in the feminist movement, we call it forum shopping. So this constant shifting from one forum to another. Who has control over that? Lastly, recalling from my WTO experience within that WTO processes, some 20 years ago, there was that same kind of challenge around the control of information about the process itself, at the ministerials, what was going to be discussed, when it was going to be discussed, who would be put in charge of what aspect of the WTO negotiations. So this is the kind of challenge we have with OECD. With the UN, yes, it may have its challenges, but the starting point is the rules of decision making are clear, and the access is equal. Yes, there will be fights and there will be pressures within that space, but the forum itself has rules and those rules say that all countries who are members are there on an equal basis. So within the General Assembly, within the second committee where some of these things would start, you have all countries have access to that. And lastly, that countries already are organized or can organize, so you have the Africa group within that space in New York. You have the G77 already organized. In OECD, I know there's the G24, but we also have a number of other countries that are not part of that. But ultimately, I think the UN gives a better shot at achieving fair allocation of taxing rights. And let's not forget that at the end of the day, what we're really talking about here is not just around taxing rights, but the right to development and the right of countries to choose their own development path. So the whole principle on which the UN is premised is very different from that of the OECD around that. So it would definitely be a better space. We still would have to be organized in it to deal with those dynamics that come from the different, from the political economy and the interest around this issue. But it would certainly be a better shot than trying to use a forum where we are really there on sufferance.
Thank you so much, Irene. I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I think creating a space where at the very minimum have an equal playing field, I think makes the big difference. So I'm gonna ask, I think just for an extra 2-3 minutes as we wrap up, because we've just come to what was supposed to be the end of our time. Theo, do you have any sort of final comments that you want to add before you wrap up?
Thank you, Chinai. I just want to very quickly mention something that Alvin was saying before he went off. He said breaking down, this messages, in easy to understand ways, which is very, very, very important.
Theo, are you still there?
There are some of these technical discussions. What I'm actually pointing at is the fact that, the people have been left out somehow in our advocacy as one of our advocacy targets.
Yeah.
Because it's important to empower the people, to educate them on these issues. We've mentioned instances where governments have been forced to sign, you've been coerced to sign. And it's important to note that where governments fail, people take over. You know, the governments fail, people take over, and people cannot take their responsibility if they are not well informed, they are not properly educated on issues like this. So it's very important that our advocacy messages target the people, you know, in very easy to understand, you know, ways so that they can go under the skin of this issue when it's due.
Yeah, thanks so much, Theo. And I think, yeah, just as we wrap up this conversation, there's a lot of takeaways that I think are really important. But I think the one thing that's really, really clear is that we need to have more of these conversations. We didn't get to answer all of the different questions, and I can see so many comments coming up in the chat as well as in the Q&A. So we may consider having a second set of this. But I think as I wrap up, just because I see Alvin is still not here. There's
I'm here.
as Brian.
As Brian, my apologies for that.
No problem, Alvin. I was about to wrap up, but if you're here, could you wrap up? I know you and I had a conversation about, forward thinking, next steps, clear action steps, so that this doesn't just become a talk shop. So can I ask you to kind of wrap up with, where we go from here?
Thank you, Chennai. I think that, and that's really in my brief submission, that's the point I was trying to make. I think that we are just at the beginning of these conversations. I think while there is a lot of celebration about the global minimum tax, I think in reality, particularly for developing countries, we're just at the beginning. And the bigger question that's going to be in the room is that the final outcome of this for developing countries and for African countries will depend on their bargaining power. And how do we get that? That, I think, is a very fundamental question. And bargaining power means that there's work that we have to do at home and there's work we have to do internationally. I think we cannot afford to have a narrow purview of just looking at the global processes. Of course, we are very critical about the OECD and the work that they're doing, but if there's something that we picked up from Logan's presentation is that even at home, we have politicized institutions and depoliticized processes. So you find that the institutions are very politicized. They're political appointees that bring in little capacities, but at the same time, the processes that are purely political have been depoliticized. And I think here there is work that we have to do as a collective, as international organizations such as ETAF, as civil society organizations, and organizing forums like this where we are consistently talking and consistently sharing minds and empowering ourselves, because if this is a political process that we are involved in, then it means that it has to be sustained. It can't be an on-off exercise. We have to continue sustaining the fight, supporting the countries. And I think I liked a lot the point that Logan made about on one side coming out and supporting countries that have stood firm, but those ones that even buckled under the pressure, they also need support, not just calling them out, but also continuously engaging them. I think one last point I would really like to make from TGN's perspective is that we will continue creating forums, similar forums, to continue these conversations that brings together a cross array of actors, so that if there was that dream of a common Africa position, Irene, that you were speaking to, that common Africa position will have to be an amalgamation of both technical work that organizations as ETAF is doing and the political work. And that's how we'll get a common Africa position, which then, if we enter into a bargaining space that are going to be emerging, then we will be entering those spaces from a point of strength and not from a point of weakness. Those are the few points I would like to add, Chennai.
Great. Thank you so much, Alvin. I think thank you so much for wrapping it up. And I think very clearly speaking to the fact that this is something that we need to continue to be discussing. We need to also, sustain this conversation. I can see Jane from Siatini indicating that, we need to be mobilizing at national level. because essentially that's where we see the scaling up of the discussions and conversations. And I think as TGNA, one of the things we can do, because for a lot of people, this is a very complex conversation, right? Put explainers that explain in a way that is easy to understand what's being negotiated and what's being agreed to, so that we can empower the civil society at national level to then engage with their ministries of finance and tax revenue authorities. And I think the point Irene made too as well, we also need to be doing our own cost benefit analyses. I saw Matty from the FTC comment in the chat section that, you know, the OECD, when they did their analysis, they stopped at 15%, right? And on our part, you know, knowing that on the African continent, our CIT ranges between 25 and 30%, that's where we should have also been, you know, doing our cost benefit analysis and engaging different institutions to do so. So on that note, I would really like to thank everybody for participating in this webinar. Thank you so much to our panelists, Logan, Irene, Yako, Tony, Theo. I know Dereje had to leave us. Really, really great input. And I think a fantastic conversation. We will definitely be in touch, I think, with next steps. But apart from that, wishing you all an enjoyable rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chennai, for the wonderful moderation.
Great.
Thank you, Chena, for a good discussion and good moderation. Bye-bye.
Bye.
See you tomorrow, Irene.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you.